Today you're about to learn the 6 main rules of attack from the legend himself, Mikhail Tal. We've got a pretty interesting clash of world champions. Tal, the 8th world champion, is playing white against Karpov, the 12th world champion, who is playing black here. And we can see that Karpov is choosing the very solid Caro-Kann defense because everyone knew how aggressive and attacking Tal is. Now, Tal goes for c4, which is actually a great opening choice against the Caro-Kann defense. And I know that many of you guys bet on aliens. That is totally fine, but nevertheless, this idea definitely makes a lot of sense. We anticipate black to move the pawn here, and therefore we're ready to capture it twice, which happened in the game. And now Karpov played the correct move, but most of your opponents will play the most obvious move, the recapture queen takes d5, which has an obvious downside, similar to the Scandinavian defense, where white can develop a knight with a tempo and get some lead in development. That position is already good for white. Now, in the game that did not happen, instead of capturing the pawn with a queen, Karpov, of course, played the correct move, knight to f6, aiming to take this pawn back with a knight, and that happened, knight c3, knight takes, and after knight to f3, Karpov took knight takes c3, which brings us to the very first rule: to take is a mistake. This is a very classical Igor Nation rule: avoid unmotivated exchanges. For instance, in the current situation, we can notice that black had a very active centralized knight, and black trades it off voluntarily. On top of that, he also strengthens white's center so that white would have these great pawns in the middle of the board, and black achieved nothing. Now, of course, Karpov knew the rule, but we gotta be objective here. While facing Tal, a lot of his opponents felt the urge to exchange pieces or even pens. It's understandable. Now, black plays g6, trying to also reinforcing the position of his future castling, and then after d4, we've got both sides developing pieces, knight c6, so forward standard, rook to e1. Now, pretty nice and flexible move by white, because even though normally in this position we would expect white to develop the bishop somehow, perhaps here or here, maybe even in this direction, but since bishop has different options, and for the rook there is not much to choose from, Tal chooses to play this move, which makes sense for sure, and later he can decide where to put the bishop. This also, just in case, prevents black from pushing the pawn forward and attacking white's center. Black plays rook e8, which is quite a funny move. It looks like Tal hypnotized his opponent. He played rook e1, and black goes rook to e8. There were actually rumors that Tal could somehow hypnotize his opponents with his deadly stare. Now, of course, I don't really think it is the case, it's just that his style of play was so unusual that it often confused his opponent. Nevertheless, in this case, it kind of looks a bit funny that black plays this awkward move. Now, the move is probably not the best, but it does make some sense. Black is potentially trying to play e5 and strike in the center. Tal goes bishop g5, which develops the bishop and also pins this pawn so that it can't ever be pushed forward, or at least not in the near future. Now, black played bishop to e6, a move that a lot of people could not understand why Karpov played that move, but in reality, where could this bishop go? Like, black does not want to develop it here because white can take it and double black's pawn structure. Bishop g4 was the most natural move to play, but the issue for black here is after h3, the bishop has to take this knight. It can't go back because then it will be trapped, right? And trading on f3 is not the end of the world, but strong players usually do not want to give their opponents two bishops advantage, and therefore Karpov probably disliked this option for that reason. Therefore, he developed the bishop here, perhaps aiming to move it somewhere to the middle of the board down the line. However, it never happened because all of a sudden Tal sacrificed his rook, which brings us to the second rule of attack, this time exactly from Tal himself, who said there are two types of sacrifices, correct ones and mine. Now, the issue here is that, of course, there is no clear attack and no clear checkmate as a result of this sacrifice. Moreover, it's not very clear how white is even going to attack after that. But that was the whole point of Tal. He knew that it is always easier to attack than to defend. And this sacrifice a little bit opens up this diagonal against the black king and overall weakens the black's castling position. Therefore, it would potentially allow white to keep expanding on his attack later on, and overall for black it's much harder to figure out what to do next. So again, the idea is just go for an attack. Even if it's not completely sound, it is just much easier to attack than to defend. Tal continued bishop c4, taking aim at this pawn. Karpov defends it and Tal attacks it once again. At this point, Karpov played a very natural looking move, knight to d8, guarding the pawn, which brings us to the third rule. Looking backward, twist your neck and your position. Somehow I noticed that Moves backward very often are wrong in chess, even though there is no clear way to explain that, but it's just a rule of thumb. Whenever you drive your piece back, like, you always gotta second guess that decision, because again, very often it is just wrong. And in this case, just think about this. Black is taking this very healthy bulldog and moves it backward just to guard this little donut. And that is it. Quite sad, right? So it's much better usually to even give up a little bit of material but to stay active. And computer actually suggests here quite a brilliant idea for black, initially to go king to h8 to avoid that passive defensive move and to sidestep this check. But in this position, comp recommends knight to e5. A really beautiful idea which allows black to trade off some pieces and therefore to slow down white's attack. Because of this interference, black will trade off either knights, or if white captures on e5, that would allow black to capture the bishop on e6. Either way, black would trade off some pieces, which is good for a defender. In the actual game, though, Karpov moved the knight back, and Tal plays rook to e1, which brings us to the next rule of attack. Bring all your pieces into the party. Now, here's the thing. When you hear this rule, it just sounds such a common sense thing. However, as a chess coach, I analyzed plenty of games, and I can tell you that this is a very clear difference between beginner players and advanced players. When I look at games of beginners, very often I see the situation where we've got the position where one or both sides have their queenside rooks still standing in their original positions, while the game is already won by someone, right? And if you look at strong players, that very rarely, if ever, happens. They always make sure to bring all their pieces into play. And here, white does that, and black does the same thing just as well. Rook to c8, activating the final piece and putting some pressure down here. Now, what would white play here? Now, certainly, even though white has 3 attackers against this pawn on a6, but white does not want to just go ahead and trade off everything. Now, that would be a big mistake, and Tal did not play it. If white were to trade everything on e6, that would transpose the game into a dull endgame position where black is ahead in material and also this pawn falls. Therefore, that is just bad. That said, it's not easy for white to make progress, and Tal starts to regroup. He moves the knight to d2, black goes king to h8 to get rid of this dangerous diagonal, and then Tal moves his knight to e4, hitting the queen. The queen retreats back while counterattacking the bishop, but now as the bishop goes back, there is this big upside for having the knight right here. It guards this pawn on c3, and therefore black cannot just capture it. So Tal was pretty prudent in his attack as well. And Karpov goes pawn e5, the move which seemed to make a lot of sense. Black's got those weak doubled pawns, and he's offering an exchange of one of them. Now, a lot of players in such positions mechanically capture here on e5, and we already know that to take is a mistake. Unmotivated exchanges usually only help your opponent to activate his position, and now white is really quite struggling to find any attacking ideas after that. Instead, Tal followed another idea. He played pawn to h4, and there is a really cool quote from Tal about that. He said, "I like to grasp the initiative and not give my opponent peace of mind." Of course, these days we've got phone notifications doing that job perfectly well. Now, jokes aside, I really love the general strategy behind this idea, because when your opponent plays something like e5 attacking you, it's very natural for us to be reactive, to start thinking, oh, should I take here? Should I defend this? Like, what am I going to do about that? But Tal has a different way of thinking. He says, I want to lead the game. I want to own the initiative. I don't just want to respond to what my opponent has to do here. And that's the idea behind this pawn h4, h5 idea. Black captures on d4, and Tal still ignores that and just pushes his own plan forward. Now, once these pawns are traded off, the king becomes pretty vulnerable, and yet black takes on h5 anyways. At this point, Tal recaptured, which is of course a very natural move for white to play, and it was also a blitz game, therefore queen takes h5 makes a lot of sense. With that being said, there was a nice combo that Tal missed here. And I'll give you an opportunity to find a move that Tal couldn't find during the game. So you may think about this. It is white to play. And while you're thinking, by the way, there was also one interesting story where Tal shared his own secret to success. Next year, in 1988, there was the first official World Blitz Championship. And Tal won the tournament ahead of Karpov and Kasparov, despite the fact that Tal was 51 years old at the time. And later when he was asked like how he could achieve that, he responded with something like, I didn't take the tournament too seriously, I walked the press room, smoked a few cigarettes, and sacrificed a few pieces. So that is basically Tal's secret to chess success. Now the move was knight to f6. A pretty cool move, definitely very unexpected idea. And white is capitalizing on the pin. right? And the rook is attacked. And if black captures the knight, there is queen takes c8, which delivers this quick checkmate. Therefore, black can't really take the knight. And if he takes with the bishop, we take with our bishop, and it's the same stuff. Otherwise, black needs to guard the rook, and if the rook moves away, then white keeps sacrificing the same knight. Knight takes h7, totally opening up the king, and now queen takes h5 comes with a checkmate. Notice that there is this bishop controlling the square, therefore the king cannot retreat, and otherwise it's a checkmate. Back to the actual game, Tal played a much more natural move, queen takes h5, hitting the rook, and once Karpov moved the rook away, Tal plays bishop to c2, taking aim at that pawn on h7. And now white plans to just get this knight out of the way, move it somewhere to f6 or d6, just sacrifice it, get it out, and then play queen takes h7 checkmate. It looks very critical for black, however, Karpov played a very strong defensive move, queen to e5. A great idea with a double pin, both to the knight and the bishop. The bishop cannot move or else the queen will be lost, and similarly the knight cannot move or else this rook will be lost on e1. With that being said, Tal played what nowadays we call faTALity. Knight to g3. He says go ahead. He's given up this rook with a check, which also attacks the white king, and at first it looks just like a blunder. However, after king moves to h2, it turns out there's no easy way for black to prevent this checkmate. Queen takes h7. In the game, Karpov played h6. Computer claims that there was a brilliant defensive move, bishop h6, but of course it's very hard to comprehend. Why is this a great move? Because it looks like white can just take it, but that leads to some absolutely mind-boggling variation. Bishop takes, attacking the rook, and once the rook moves, white can sack the bishop right here, and now we've got absolute madness, but somehow computer claims that after rook to c6, that is an equal position. Again, very hard to comprehend what is going on right here. The idea is rook takes h7 does not work because of this checkmate, but how come rook to c6 is such a strong move, and how come it is an equal position? Of course, it's beyond our comprehension. In the game, Karpov moved the pawn to h6, and of course white captures it. Now this is very dangerous for black. Black cannot take it because then queen takes h6 comes with a check, and then queen to h7 checkmate. Instead, Karpov tried to get the king out of the way, but then bishop takes g7. Now the king is absolutely exposed. Black still cannot really take it because of this queen to g6 checkmate with a quick checkmate right after that. Therefore, instead of that, Karpov goes for this desperate counter-attacking attempt, rook takes f2, putting some pressure on white as well. And even though it's clear that this king is extremely vulnerable, it's never too late to ruin a good game. We know this from our sad past experience. And now I'm pretty sure that a lot of players would play something like this, just hoping that there will be some quick checkmate, but then the king would escape, and within a couple of checks you realize that, hey, you know what? Actually the king runs away, and the position still remains to be very unclear. This brings us to the next rule of attack. Do not just chase the king, corner it. Think about this. Right now we've got the king standing right there without any defenders, and it's easy for us to keep creating more and more threats. However, if you just start delivering checks, the king will run away and will approach the rest of his army. And after that, the king will become much better defended. We do not want that. Therefore, we need to deliver checks in such a way where the king would be taking off those vital squares where he could potentially retreat to and escape. And Tal does that just to keep the king right here in the corner, and now he can successfully checkmate it. And that is why we call such games immorTAL. If you want to know how to crush everyone with the most aggressive opening for white, check out this video and have a great rest of the day.